Ich bin Kitze. My German is terrible. I care about three things mostly: React, open source, and making products. So maybe you know some of my products. Some of my open source work is custom React scripts and MobX router. From the products that I've made, I have OK Google, Sizzy.co, and React Academy. So Sizzy is a tool for previewing and testing responsive websites, but on multiple devices at once. So if you're a web developer, and of course you're here, you might want to check out Sizzy.co. Lately, I devoted myself to teaching, so that's the only thing I do. I launched a project called React Academy. It's like training for conferences and for events or for companies. So I'm teaching React, React Native, Redux, MobX, everything basically around the React ecosystem. And you can find more about me at kitze.io. I grabbed Kitze on GitHub, Kitze on Medium, but unfortunately someone grabbed Kitze on Twitter, tweeted once, and he doesn't give me the account. So I'm the Kitze on Twitter. So today we're going to talk about how do we do a login in High Sierra. That's some code that Apple oh no, sorry, just kidding. We're going to talk about state management in a GraphQL era. Thank you. So the short version of what is GraphQL is that thing you keep postponing on that you don't need to learn it, but eventually it's going to replace REST. So my advice would be, as you saw from the previous talk, that you should start and learn GraphQL. So what do we have with the REST API? If we want to grab a bunch of things, we have to execute like multiple queries and then combine them on the client somehow. And with GraphQL, it would look something like this, where the client will just ask exactly what it needs without like launching a few queries and then combining them. Every component or like every page can just request what it needs. So it gives us control on the client. So talking about control on the client, my opinion is that single page apps ruined everything because we were aiming to do a faster car, but we ended up with that thing. So we managed to put everything on the client, and now it's a mess. So by everything on the client, what I mean is, what is state management? So we have forms, we have routing, we have inputs, tabs, filters, date pickers, so on and so forth. But the biggest thing, like the elephant in the room, the biggest problem, because state management is hard, is data. So everything else is small, but data is like the big problem that we were trying to solve with different libraries, frameworks, and so on. So yeah, it's the #1 reason why state management is hard, because we need few of these things. So we need to do data fetching, we need to do caching, we need to read that data, we eventually have to invalidate that cache, so that complicates our front ends. So let's go back a little bit and see how did we do like single page apps back in the day. This is me writing jQuery. This is my jQuery spaghetti code. So my first single page app is still live for like the government of my country. They still use it. It's like 3,000 or 4,000 lines of jQuery. There are no modules. There's no ES6. So there's literally like code, a bunch of code. And then you see a comment saying the calendar starts here. So there's a calendar plugin, and then you continue with the code. So it was a pretty mess. I mean, it's a big mess. It's working, but it's hard to maintain it because that piece of code is doing everything. It's doing the state management, it's controlling the tabs, it's doing the data fetching. So you cannot, the things are not separated properly. So then we moved on to Angular, or whatever they call it these days, probably just Angular. They have a lot of versions of it. And it made sense for me. Like when I moved to jQuery to Angular for state management and for everything, it was perfect because it's easy. You have controllers, everything is separated. And I loved that at first because when you go from jQuery, like the 3,000 line file, to something like Angular, it gets better. But the funny part is, it sounds good in your head until you explain it to people. So I had a roommate, and he was like, all right, let's talk about Angular. I'm like, don't worry, it's just like a directive, you put it into a controller, and then you inject it, and the factory, it's a service, but it's not a service. So it wasn't that easy. In my head, it was easy, but it's not actually easy. How do we do state management in Angular? It was a mess. So then we moved on to the thing we're all here to talk about. I won't dwell on it. Yeah, it's great. We love it. It solved everything. Yeah, all right. So when I started doing React, I was trying to be too smart, like literally day one, and I'm trying to be too smart with the API. So I'm fetching a bunch of things, but I'm like, how do I cache these things so I don't display loading spinners all the time? So I just displayed a loading spinner once. So I did my own like internal network cache thingy. I was trying to be too smart, but then I was like, how I'm gonna update this cache? Like, it's cool, I cached it once, but next time something updates, how do I do like a nested update on a bunch of those objects? And then I got into a mess. So working with this mess of like caching and updating and so on, it naturally led with all the hype online to Redux. So Redux seemed like the solution that I needed for my state management problem. So I went to Redux, I listened to like all the tutorials online, I saw the Egghead course, and I moved on to Redux. So my relationship with it is I love it and I hate it at the same time. I love it because the concept is really genius. If you haven't seen like the Egghead tutorials, it's really awesome. It's really easy to recreate. But I hate it because it's a lot of boilerplate to do simple things, and it's actually overhyped and not needed in most of situations. So you may think that I'm a douchebag for saying this, but I'm not saying this. The creator of Redux is saying that. So if we see what he's posting about, he's saying like, he's posting articles like you might not need Redux, and he's tweeting about no hard feeling, it's overhyped, low level, and often unnecessary. Just people are not listening to him, so they're still using it in situation where it's not needed. So yeah, here's an example post on Reddit. So this literally happened. You can find it on Reddit. There was a React beginner asking, how do I do network requests in React? And literally, the first answer was just use Redux. How do you say just use Redux Saga? How do you say just in that? That's like your friend calling you, hey, there's a spider in my house, and you're like, oh, I just bring my bazooka or something. So it's like totally unneeded answer, just use Redux Saga. You could use it, but in more complex situation, not to a beginner for data fetching. So this was me explaining Redux to my friend. I explained a bunch of things to my friends, Angular, Redux, and so on. So we sat down, he was an Angular developer, and he was like, let's do this app, we're gonna do it with jQuery or whatever, it's a simple list. Like I have a company and we do coffee every day, so we want a random person to do the coffee. So let's just do a randomizer where we put in a bunch of names, we generate one person. And I was like, we must use Redux for this, because at that time I was like, Redux, React, you know, we must use all of these tools. I was like, why, man? It's just gonna be 5 lines of jQuery, randomize an array, show a name. I'm like, no, it's a good example for me to teach you Redux. And he's like, fine. We're sitting in a restaurant and I'm teaching him Redux, like the whole code to push something into an array, to grab it and so on. He's like, I'm going to give up. I'm not going to do this, you know. And at that moment I realized maybe we're really overcomplicating simple things. Maybe I should try something else. So I told him, don't worry, tomorrow I will try to learn this MobX thing everyone is talking about, and I'll let you know if it's good enough. And actually at that period, from then on, I haven't used Redux in my apps. When I was not using GraphQL, I'm using MobX all of the time because it simplified things, it's less boilerplate, and I like it more. And my point is, now that we complicated state management, we always had this wars on the front end, right? So we had like jQuery versus MooTools back in the day, Angular versus Ember, we have GraphQL versus REST, we have Redux versus MobX, React versus Vue, Apollo versus Relay, and so on and so forth. But the mistake we're all doing here is we're asking what's better instead of asking what's suitable for my app, what is suitable for our team, for our current situation, for the project that we're doing. Everyone is asking what's better, and that's the wrong question. Because I think that Trump is great, but on a golf court. So it's really about the context of the thing. You cannot say this is better and this is worse if you don't explain like in which kind of situation. So let's go and see some examples about fetching a simple list of to-dos, starting with Redux. So for Redux, I need 2 slides to fetch a list of to-dos. One with the async action. Second for the reducer, where I need to grab the data, eventually I normalize the data, dispatch some actions, put it in the store. So it's like 2 slides of code. With MobX, we have the same thing. We just have one class. We have a bunch of observables, like decorators and so on. We have an action. We fetch it. But it's still a lot of code to just fetch a simple list of to-dos, right? So that's where GraphQL shines, because it's allowing us to compose multiple pieces of data together, just attach them to a component, and we're done with data fetching. So the same example in Apollo, it will take us 1 slide, but for the data and for the component at the same time. So we have this component, to-dos, that's displaying either a loading spinner or a list of to-dos. What the component does is basically it just describes, hey, this is what I need. So I need a query that's going to give me a list of to-dos. For each to-do, I only need the title and the date. So we give the control, the total control on the client, and then we just attach it to a component. So the problem here is we were fixing the sink instead of fixing the well. And the sink would be state management, we overcomplicated, and the well would be REST APIs. So instead of fixing REST APIs and focusing how do we consume APIs and data, we were focusing on let's fix state management to grab information from a REST API. And that's what I think, that's where we went wrong. So if we go back to the previous slide about state management, this is what we had. And now if we remove the data, we're left with only this. And now it sounds way simpler, right? Because we have this GraphQL client, like Apollo or Relay, whatever. It's taking care of the hard part for us. Like all of the things we're doing manually, now they're taken care of, and we're left with this. How do we tackle this? We can see multiple solutions for it. So first, if you're asking that big data part, how much does it remove from an actual app? I have this good example. A lot of people are using it in their GraphQL slides. It's from Peggy Raises. And it's a screenshot of how many lines of Redux code they removed after they moved to Apollo. So it's around 5,000 lines. So all of the reducers, actions, actions creators, and so on are gone because now they're just defining queries. Of course, they added some code, but they removed a lot of code and a lot of responsibility out of their stack. So the big question we need to answer here is, do we even need a state management library when using GraphQL? And this is always my reaction, like, we might need it, or might. So it's really based on your context and your use case, but in most of the cases you don't. So let's see I have some example stacks that I can offer you so that you can use a combination of GraphQL with something else. So these are my names, and I'm going to explain all of them. So the first one is vanilla, and we're using Apollo or Relay. If that's better for you, we can use a router, and we're using setState. Like the thought of using setState to people is like, oh, setState, we want Redux. But this really works, because when you're fetching all of your data with GraphQL, you can just use setState for your state if your app is simple enough and allows you to do setState. Because there's this like setState doesn't scale and blah, blah, blah. But try it. It may work out for you in like most of the cases. The next one would be I hate forms. Like if you're doing this crazy, I've seen companies doing these crazy forms. Like they show you what you need to do and you instantly get a headache. Like is this complex form? You don't want to solve that with setState, right? Because that's not its job. So you want to use some kind of library, like you have Formic, you have a bunch of React libraries. If you have complex form, you want to manage forms in state management, you want to use a form library. But anything else, you can continue using setState. Then we have the next one. My users live in tunnels. So this is about if you're really focusing on a group of people that are basically that have offline needs, like they're in a place where there's no good Wi-Fi. Like it really depends. I see a lot of people optimizing their apps for offline, and their target audience is like people with the newest iPhones living in New York or something. So it's like totally wasted time if you optimize for offline. If you want to optimize for offline, this is a good stack. Like you would use Redux offline. It gives you offline compatibility out of the box, and it's pretty good. So Apollo 1.0 is actually using Redux under the hood. And this is what I like about it. Like I like the concept of Redux, but when it's somewhere like shoved under the hood of some other tool. I don't want to use it, like I don't want to do the manual work, but when someone did it for me, it's pretty great because it's under the hood and it works good. So here's how we create the Apollo store. We can combine it with our local state for our Redux store, and basically we get the two stores combined together. We can use Redux with Apollo. And if we see the screenshot of the DevTools, you can see we have a mix on the left. So we have the actions from Apollo, and we have actions that we are doing. So we have like increment, decrement of our timer, but we also get actions like init query, query is loaded, query failed, and so on. So we get everything in the DevTools. We get all of our actions when we combine, because Apollo is using Redux under the hood. So what do we get when we use Apollo plus Redux offline? So we get offline support for GraphQL queries in just few-ish lines. So this is how the offline support would look like. It's that easy. Like this is literally few lines added, and all of your queries will work offline. So whenever the user fetches a query, goes to a page, you have a query attached to that page, to that component, and next time he visits that page without a connection, it will pull the information out of local storage, and then it will work. So with few lines, we can get query support. The problem is offline mutations. So we cannot listen, like you may think, hey, we can just listen to the mutation error if it doesn't work. If we click something like liking a post, it doesn't work. We may catch that like in our reducers and do something about it, but we can't because it's actually the network level errors are swallowed before Apollo dispatches an action. So the problem is we need to use Redux offline. We need to mark all of our mutation as pending, and then we need to retry when network is available. So Redux offline is doing that out of the box. So it's waiting for network connection. Whenever it's available, it goes to your array of action that needs to be dispatched, and it eventually dispatches them to the network. So that's the solution. We need to wrap all of our mutations in Redux actions, and this is where we're starting to do manual work to do support for offline. That's what I don't like. So I need to manually, if I have a function called add to do, a mutation, I need to wrap it into an action and prepare it to be used offline. So for offline mutation, we need to store them in a store, we need to wrap them in Redux actions, and we need to do a lot of manual work to handle optimistic responses and so on. So I think this is going in the wrong direction, because the whole point of using Apollo and GraphQL is to make data fetching really easy, not to make it complicated as this. There might be a solution coming soon. They're working on this. It's called Apollo Link Offline, where we can just plug this thing. That's what I want. Just plug one thing. Offline works. Mutation works. Query works. We don't need to do any manual work. So we're going to explain it later. Let's move on to our stacks. This one is called I Want to Go Home Early. I like this tweet from the creator of MobX. It was like, MobX doesn't try to prove an academic point. It just wants you to go home early from work. So if you use Apollo, MobX React for, MobX Router, my own thing, it's literally the easiest stack. If you don't need offline support, if you don't need anything like that, but you still want a global store, you need form, etc., this might be a good suggestion. Then we're moving on to server-side rendering. What about server-side rendering? We have this stack called Next Level because of Next.js, okay? And then we can just use Apollo, Next.js, and set state. That's it. The app will be server-side rendered. The client will rehydrate the app. It will pick up, basically. React will pick up. Then we can just use set state. It works pretty good. It can still, like, just to not confuse it, this stack can also support a global store like Redux or MobX. If you want to use server-side rendering and then Redux to pick up or MobX, it still works. But for starters, it might be really good. And then I was trying this on an app, and it actually works, like going a little bit back, like how we did apps, like using full page reloads when navigating between routes. Like most of the time, you're doing the single page app just because you want to do a single page app. Like if you go to Amazon or a bunch of sites, when you click on a link or something, you will see the whole page going blank. So it's a full page refresh, right? It's not a single page app. Like I think you can barely count all of the apps that are single page app. Like take a look at Airbnb, Amazon, bunch of these apps. Most of them are using full page refresh in most of the cases. So you may want to rethink this, treat every route as a separate like mini app instead of having this huge single page app. So this is what it will look like. Like all of these routes, like about, post, a single user would be treated as mini apps. So instead of sharing state between them and so on, they'll be just server-side rendered mini apps. And then we have just a small logic for that piece of the app, and that works. Or can we use only Apollo? So is that possible to use only Apollo for state management, for data fetching, for everything? They introduced Apollo 2.0, which is faster, up to 10 times. It's smaller. It's no longer using Redux under the hood. And it has increased flexibility. They introduced something called Apollo Link, where people can write like middlewares and links and plug into the whole Apollo stack. So if before we initialize the Apollo client like this, like we have a client, we create a new Apollo client with network interface. Now with the 2.0, we would do this. So we need to configure the internals. So we're saying that for cache, you need to use this Apollo cache in memory. So that allows developers to write their own cache implementation. And there already is a faster one. So, oh, sorry, I wasn't showing the slide, or, oh no. This is where the magic happens, or these two lines are the pluggable things. So everyone can write an Apollo link, and they can integrate their own logic. And this gives us the possibility of using different cache mechanisms, like Apollo Cache Hermes. Like, they already written a cache that's faster than the Apollo cache. So just they released 2.0, and like, there's a faster cache than ours. So that's pretty great. And probably in the future, we'll have implementations where under the hood we will have MobX or MobX State Tree, Redux, whatever. Now it's really configurable. And they introduced something called Apollo Link Local, which is using schema stitching to give us access to client-side schema. So until now, we were talking about fetching data from the server, but what if we can define the whole state for our client in GraphQL and then modify it with GraphQL? So they done this Apollo Link Local. It looks like this. So we have local state, and we have a schema where we describe how do we modify that state and what happens on each mutation and so on. So we have a schema, we have query mutation, we have a counter, and we have mutations for upvoting or downvoting that counter. So this is what it will look like. When I have my to-dos component, I can combine with schema stitching, I can combine server-side data, like data that comes from the server, along with my client-side data. So these components now can describe everything that they need. I don't need a separate action, reducer, so on to describe my client state. I can just describe, hey, I need this from the local state, I need this from the server, you figure it out, give me everything I need to render, and then the component doesn't care. So I think it's gonna be really awesome. I haven't tried Apollo Link local yet, but I think it's gonna be great. All right, we already reached the confusion. That was pretty fast. When using GraphQL, I think that in 90% of the cases, you won't need Redux, MobX, Sagas, Observable, RxJS, whatever hipster state management libraries you're using. Just rethink the decision once again, because you may not need it. Just try it on a side project, start small, try it if this really works. Don't trust hype. If you have Twitter, delete your Twitter account, because it's really hard to be a developer that has a Twitter account. Like, you get this like fear of missing out, And whenever you go on vacation, you're like, oh crap, they introduced like an alternative to Redux or something. So it's pretty hard to live with a Twitter account if you're a developer. And if you still decide to use one, just maybe you should think that you're over-engineering things. Maybe. But we all like to do that sometimes. So yeah, before I finish, I got this question about how do we start with GraphQL. So a lot of people are already stuck with their REST APIs or the Redux on the client or whatever, and they're like, how can we start introducing it to our stack? So my advice is to start from bottom up. So try to find like small components that are somewhere in the bottom. So like don't start refactoring your whole app or refactoring the whole project. Just start with a small component from the bottom and then move on to the top to bigger things. And eventually you're going to replace REST on the client. If you want to move on the server and you're like, we already have this like huge backend, how do we introduce GraphQL to our backend? What the server-side clients can do is they can wrap REST APIs. I don't know if a lot of people are familiar with this concept, but we did that at our company and it worked pretty great. So we already had a huge REST API. We didn't want to get rid of it. People were still using it, but we wanted to introduce a GraphQL API on top of this REST API. So basically what you do is you describe your server-side schema with GraphQL, and then you say whenever the user needs the to-dos, just go ahead and fetch /API/to-dos. Whenever the user needs a list of users, go to /API/users and fetch the list of users. So you're using the REST API under the hood until you can eventually deprecate it, get rid of it, and move on to only GraphQL. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this was interesting. Thanks. Thanks.